Hello, my dear friend. I'm so very glad you decided to pick up this book and read of this tale, for it is quite a marvelous tale, full of adventure. It might be scary at points. Sometimes you might think everything is going wrong. But let me assure you, all turns out for good. Because, well, it always does for those with true and brave hearts. It begins a long time ago, in a world very different to our own. There lived two young boys named Jonathan and Timo. Although they were brothers, Jonathan being about a year older than Timo, they were also good friends, and they both loved adventures. They lived with their mother in a small village at the foothills of the mountains. She looked after their farm, but was often unwell, and had once broken her foot in the fields. It had never fully healed, and she required much help from the two young brothers. If they worked hard, once a week they were allowed to leave the farm and go on an adventure. A small adventure might involve wading through the shallows of the valley streams looking for crayfish. A big adventure was when their uncle would visit from the neighboring village and take them hunting in the foothills of the mountains. They loved these adventures the most. Ever since their father had gone missing in the mountains over 3 years ago, they had spent a lot of time with their uncle. Jonathan and Timo would watch as he expertly tracked deer, wild boar and mountain goats, and he never missed with his humongous willow bow. The three would camp under the stars and hear stories of the trolls that lived in the mountains, and of the fairies that lived under them. "Are trolls and fairies really real?" asked Timo curiously. "Perhaps," replied his uncle, "but I've never seen them in my lifetime or in the life of my father. Just stories, I would imagine, told to keep little ones in bed at night. But the world is big and we are small." He finished, gazing up at the stars. Jonathan and Timo could lie out there forever. Their dreams on those nights would be full of adventure. Dreams of the fairies under the mountains, of the king's throne room, and its secret passageways. But I digress, for I have a tale to tell. This particular adventure began as all the brothers' adventures did. Breakfast. They quickly ate some bread their mother had baked the day before, covered in rich honey, fresh from the hives. After breakfast, they packed their bags, bringing along some bread, aged cheese, and some rock apples. Rock apples are not what they sound like, but they do keep forever. Lastly, Timo packed his emergency survival kit, which he brought on every adventure. Then, picking up their walking sticks, they said goodbye to their mother and walked out the door, hearts keen for adventure. Little did they know that this adventure would not be a small adventure, nor would it be a big adventure. No, this adventure would be a most adventurous adventure. Jonathan and Timo decided that they would hike up to the higher foothills of the mountains, where the hills met the forests, where the trees grew tall and strong, sometimes so thick you could barely walk through. It was in these places they would often hunt for deer with their uncle. Jonathan had seen a large stag a few days ago with a broken antler, and after describing its grandeur to Timo, they decided to see if they could find it again. After quite a hike, they came to part of the forest they had not been to before. It was full of big, strong oak trees, and they grew in dense, unorganized rows. They moved in and out of the trees, pretending they were their uncle, tracking and hunting deer and wild boar. Suddenly, something caught their eye. Leaning against a tree was a long, large bow. Next to it, a dark quiver filled with black arrows. They stood still, staring at the discovery. Jonathan stepped closer. "Don't touch it," whispered Timo as he looked around to see if the owner was nearby. Why would someone leave this here, just lying around? Jonathan asked. Someone's been up here hunting, and they must have left it behind. Or they're nearby and coming back, exclaimed Timo nervously. Just then, Timo noticed something else. Deer tracks, and fresh ones too. His worries lessened as the possibility of tracking a deer rose. Timo and Jonathan's eyes followed the tracks further into the trees, when suddenly, out from behind a tall fir, stepped a large stag with only one antler. There it is, whispered Jonathan, as he and Timo ducked behind a tree. It had not seen them. It's huge. Imagine if we brought it home for Mother. There was a glint in his eyes which did not go unnoticed by Timo. Don't do it, whispered Timo, watching as his brother eyed the bow and arrows. Just one shot, replied Jonathan. Then I'll put it back. Okay, good idea, said Timo, the excitement now overruling any doubts or thoughts of common sense. He handed his brother the bow. Jonathan fitted an arrow to the bowstring and crept from behind the tree. The large stag was standing unawares amongst a particularly thick portion of forest. Jonathan edged closer, his heart beating very fast. He paused behind a fallen tree, just 20 paces from the deer, pulled back as far as he could on the bowstring, took aim, adjusted for the distance as his uncle had taught him, pulled even harder and missed. The arrow did not make it halfway to the deer, for this was a great strong bow and Jonathan was only a child. Only a great hunter or something bigger could have used this bow. But it had done enough to scare the deer. It sprang away up the mountain with frightful pace. Timo and Jonathan ran after it, although the deer was much faster. It ran swiftly through the trees towards a large cliff at the base of the mountains. There before the cliff stood a large boulder, the size of a house, which the deer ducked behind for shelter. Timo and Jonathan, looking ahead while running, noticed it did not re-emerge from the other side. Jonathan and Timo paused their chase. It must be behind that rock, panted Timo, gazing forward at the large stone standing before the tall cliff at the base of the mountain. If I creep up on that side, he pointed to the left side of the rock, and you go that way, pointing to the right side, we'll have it trapped, and you can get another shot. They had quite forgotten about leaving the bow behind after just one shot. Good idea, whispered Jonathan, excited at the prospect of redeeming himself. He and Timo crept closer. They were quite close to the large boulder and kept their eyes peeled to make sure the deer did not emerge from either side, trying to escape their brilliant trap. They crept closer, hearts pounding even though they knew they weren't in any real danger. Deer are not dangerous. And they had quite forgotten about who might the bow belong to. Jonathan was now nearing the right side of the stone, and still the deer had not emerged from behind it. The large cliffs loomed up in front of him as he took out another arrow from the quiver. Fitting it to the bow, he nodded to Timo, who had now reached the left side of the boulder. Silently but quickly, he darted around the stone, but nothing was there. The deer was nowhere to be seen. Timo emerged from the other side of the rock, looking puzzled. I never saw it come out. Where did it go? Asked Timo, walking towards his brother. Jonathan, who had rushed around faster than his brother, was standing still, facing the cliff, and in front of him was a small opening in the rock face. Must have gone in there, he said. Looks too narrow, said Timo. Those antlers wouldn't have fit, but it must have gone somewhere. The opening was a sharp crack in the face of the cliff, just tall and wide enough for a small child to walk through. It had stood there for many years, hidden from view of possible onlookers by the large boulder. The brothers peered into the darkness. They could not see the deer. Let's check it out, said Jonathan, grinning, his adventurous spirit rising within him again. Maybe we'll find the deer. If it did go inside, it wouldn't have gone far. Timo doubted their chances of finding anything, but needed no convincing to continue an adventure. They took a few steps inside the cave. It was dark and cold, and feeling the walls, they noticed that they were damp and mossy. They ventured in around 30 paces before the dwindling light made it harder to find their way. Turning back, and a little disappointed they had to cut their exploration short, Timo laughed out loud. I completely forgot, he exclaimed. My emergency survival kit. Adventures big and small, one thing was for certain. Timo would be there and would never, ever forget his emergency survival kit. His emergency survival kit consisted of a water skin, flint and steel to make fires, a small box of tinder to catch a spark, some rolls of cloth dipped in sap from a fire tree, a bandage, some flour gum to chew on if he ran out of food, and a small knife. They left the cave, and Timo, finding a suitable stick, took out his emergency survival kit, wrapped the end of the stick in a sap-covered cloth, and handed it to Jonathan. Hold this, he said. He then pulled out some tinder and lit a small flame with the flint and steel. He held up the tinder to the cloth, and soon they had a well-made torch that could burn for hours. Their uncle would have been proud. They entered the cave again. With their newfound source of light, they could see much further into the tunnel. It seemed to head in a rather straight line into the heart of the mountain. With excited faces, they journeyed down the tunnel. They found that it did not branch or detour, increasing their boldness in venturing deeper down a cave they had only just discovered. Jonathan turned around and could still see the opening of the cave in the distance, but it was now quite small. The tunnel turned slightly, and the crack of light disappeared out of sight. The path continued another 20 paces when they came to a set of stairs. Halfway down, they both stopped and stared at each other, coming to the same conclusion at the same time. Stairs. Who had built them, and for what purpose? Where do they lead to? Both excitement and nervousness rose in their hearts. This was indeed a great adventure. What should we do? Asked Timo, looking to his older brother for guidance. There was a pause. Jonathan was lost in thought. Not sure, he answered after a while. Let's go a little further, then turn back. They walked down the remaining stairs and came to a fork in the tunnel. This is awesome, said Jonathan, unable to control his excitement. Who do you think made these? No idea, said Timo. But I don't really want to go much further. Not if there's more than one road. We'll get lost, and the torch won't burn forever. They decided to turn back and return to the cave the next day with more torches. But this is where their adventure took a turn. For once they had climbed the stair, rounded the bend, and had the entrance in sight, the light from the crack was blocked by a large figure, and a voice was heard speaking before the entrance of the cave. You reckon they went down there? Those thieves, growled the voice. Must have, said a higher and harsher voice not in view. Jonathan and Timo quickly laid on the cave floor, and without thinking, Timo smothered his torch. They were now lying in darkness. The voices continued. I want my bow back. I'll be needing it soon, said the voice. Timo and Jonathan's hearts sank. It took me ages to make. Not every day you come across a dark elm. I swear I'll make them pay if I get my hands on them. They can't hide in there forever, snarled the second voice. I ain't waiting. The voice paused, and, as if spoken through an evil grin, it spoke. Send a dog in. Flush 'em out. The other voice laughed and gave a horrible call. Within seconds, barking could be heard at the cave entrance, and the shape of a very large dog could be seen against the light of the crack. In you go, boy, said the dark figure. Get me those thieves. Jonathan and Timo had heard enough. They sprang up, and with their hands brushing against the walls, they felt their way deeper into the tunnel. They could hear the dog following behind. Luckily, it was also finding it difficult in the dark, but its smell was keen. "The stairs will be coming up soon," whispered Timo. Just then, he stepped forward and found that the ground was not there. They had found the stairs. He and Jonathan both fell down the steps, making an awfully loud noise. This seemed to spur the dog on. They stood up and followed the path, nursing a few bruised limbs. They then came to the fork in the tunnel, and they noticed that a dim light issued from the left-hand path. They had not noticed the light when their torch had been so bright. Now that their eyes had adjusted to the darkness, there was indeed a faint glow. "Which way?" asked Timo, hearing the dog coming ever closer. "Follow the light, I guess," said Jonathan nervously. He quickly took the bow and quiver off his back and threw them down the right-hand and darker tunnel, hoping the dog would follow the smell of the bow and not of theirs. They turned left and were able to move at a faster pace in the dim light. They hurried along, bending and meandering where the path led them. After a while, they paused and listened for signs they had been followed. It was silent. "Brilliant work with that bow," whispered Timo, patting his brother on the back. "Shh! We're not out of the woods yet. Or the cave," grinned Jonathan nervously. They waited. After a long while, they felt it was safe to talk. "What were those things?" asked Timo. "Do you think they were trolls?" "I don't know," said Jonathan. "Uncle always said trolls were just stories to keep children out of trouble. That thing did look pretty big, and it didn't sound like a person." "What do we do now?" asked Timo, looking nervously at his older brother. "We can't go back. Not for now, at least." Jonathan peered behind him into the darkness. "Whoever or whatever they are, they might still be out there, waiting for us to come out. And we can't just stay here. Mother will be starting to wonder where we are. She said to be back by dusk." They decided moving forward was their only option, to follow the light and see where it led them. As they walked, they noticed two things. Firstly, the light was growing stronger. Whether their eyes were adjusting better to the dim, or they were getting closer to its source, they were unsure. Secondly, they were no longer walking in silence. From the direction of the light, there was a faint hum. They crept forward. The hum grew louder, as if many voices were speaking and many feet were walking. There seemed to be quite a commotion. It did not sound threatening, rather as though a great hurry was taking place. They edged further. The light grew. Presently they could go no further, for their path was blocked by a large door. Hanging on the wall were two large bronze torches, sending brilliant light into the tunnel behind them. The door was cracked open, and peering through the gap, Jonathan and Timo witnessed the source of the humming. They peered through the crack of the open door and beheld a large gathering and a great commotion. People, tall people, men and women, were moving in and out of a great hall in a great hurry. Some were moving long tables and chairs, others herded children into other passages. Some were taking down large fabric banners and tapestries from the walls. Some sat on the floor in circles, eating what looked like a hurried meal. As Timo and Jonathan looked closer, and their eyes adjusted to the newfound brightness, they noticed that these were not people at all. These were fairies. Not the tiny winged fairies you hear about in fairy tales. These were real fairies. Tall and beautiful, strong, with skin blue like a cold winter's day, hair as white as snow. Their ears were long and pointed, and their eyes were full of light. Timo and Jonathan looked on in amazement. Their hearts were beating fast again, not with fear, but with wonder. They did not know how long they stood there watching the commotion, when suddenly their view was blocked. Standing in front of them was a tall fairy. He wore a leather tunic, and his long hair was tied behind his head. He looked just as surprised at seeing the two brothers as they did seeing a fairy. "Child of man," he whispered to himself. Quickly, he opened the door, stepped through, peered behind him to make sure nobody else had seen the little intruders, and closed the door behind him. "Well, well, well," he said with a smile. "It has been a long time since any man-children ventured down these passageways. Who are you, and how did you find our secret entrance so far from your homes?" I'm Jonathan. He's my brother Timo. We didn't mean to barge in. We were hunting a stag with one antler, and when we missed it, it ran up the mountain and hid behind a rock, and we lost track of it and thought it might have gone down this tunnel." He did not look the fairy in the eyes. "Oh," the fairy laughed. "So that was you. Well, I was pleased to hear that you did not shoot my uncle." "Your uncle's a deer?" asked Timo in amazement. The fairy smiled. "No, but he can be if he needs to. He can be many things. We can be many things." He leaned forward. "That's why you don't see us very often." "So me and my uncle have been hunting fairies?" Jonathan asked, horrified at the prospect of shooting a fairy. No, you've been hunting deer," smiled the fairy. "Usually our watchers are better at alerting us when hunters are abroad. Today they are preoccupied, and I guess they were not on the lookout for two young boys." "So you thought a deer ventured this far into the mountain?" "Well, we tried turning around at the stairs, but there were two big people or two big somethings blocking the way. They didn't sound very nice. They sent a dog in for us. They wanted the bow back." Timo looked anxious. For a moment the fairy stood, no longer smiling but peering off into the distance, deep in thought. Then he smiled again. "Well, you are safe now, but I do not advise you to go back from where you came. That path may not be safe anymore. Indeed, these mountains are no longer safe. You should not be hunting without your Uncle Erbo." The brothers quickly looked at each other, then back to the fairy in amazement. "How do you know Uncle's name?" they asked. "I know your uncle well. Erba is a friend of the fairies." "So when I asked him if fairies were real, he knew the truth," exclaimed Timo. "Yes, but some things are better kept secret. Your uncle knew that." "But if fairies are real, does that mean trolls are also real?" The brothers looked up at the fairy, hoping that trolls would remain a fairy tale. The fairy looked at them. His face was kind. "The world is big, and we are small. Many things are real, many things are hidden. But come, let us talk of other things, and let us find a way for you to get back home. You have not come at a very pleasant hour for the fairies, for we are moving. The mountain is no longer safe. We are finding a new home." Before being led into the hall, Timo looked up at the fairy and asked, "Excuse me, sir, but what is your name?" "Oh, you must forgive me, for I have not been a good welcomer. My name is Ezkaleb, of the House of Hud." Ezkaleb led the two brothers before him back into the large hall. Silence filled the room as each fairy paused what they were doing and stood in amazement, their faces filled with wonder and curiosity. It was indeed a long time since a man-child had entered the fairy halls under the mountain. Presently, Ezkaleb raised his voice. "Let me introduce our two newest guests, Jonathan and Timo, of the House of Erba." At the mention of their uncle, there was much chatter and a murmur arose around the room. It seemed to the two boys that their uncle Erba was well known to the fairies. What else did they not know about their uncle? Two tall fairies approached the visitors. They were wearing what seemed to be leather armor, but it was so beautifully woven together that it may have well been a ceremonial suit. They knelt down to the brothers' level. "Welcome, Timo and Jonathan, children of men. It warms our hearts to see the family of Ebba in our halls, especially on a day like this. Well go." They bowed and left. "Well go?" Jonathan asked. "You are welcome, and he bids you the same blessing when you go." Escaleb smiled. He led them through the large hall, which had now returned to the same level of busyness as before. 3 young fairylings ran over to Jonathan and Timo, their faces beaming with excitement. "Well come and well go," said one. "I'm Smith. These are my sisters, Mahoney and Mally." Their eyes were examining them from head to toe. "Why are your ears so funny?" asked Mally. Jonathan did not know how to reply, but he felt quite embarrassed by his very normal ears. As they ran off, Timo heard them whispering excitedly to each other. "The child of man has come." Escaleb then led them into a large corridor that extended further into the mountain, and then through a large and beautifully decorated archway, which brought them to an equally large staircase, carved into the very rock of the mountain. It was covered in soft white carpet with golden patterns woven skillfully throughout. "Where are we going?" asked Timo, gazing at his surroundings. "Before I take you home, you must pay homage to our king." Escaleb looked down at the brothers, who now looked rather nervous. "Don't worry, he is a good king. But mind your manners, for he is the king." Timo and Jonathan followed Escaleb further up the stairs. As they passed through 2 extremely beautiful stone doors, they entered the grandest room of the mountain. The children were amazed at what they saw, and to Timo's surprise, he could have sworn that he had been in this hall before. It looked very familiar, although it seemed to him that a particular statue was out of place. He put the thought out of his mind. The king's throne room was a sight to behold. It must have once been an ancient cave with stalactites and stalagmites on either side of the hall, beautifully preserved by the skilled craftsmanship of the fairies. Throughout the natural cave were carved pathways, seating areas, and a throne. The throne seemed to shine with its own light, and upon it sat the king. Jonathan and Timo stared at him, unable to look away. He seemed both young and old, happy but deeply sad, beautiful, but his face bore the scars of past battles. He was a mighty king. He had only just been briefed of the arrival of the 2 children of men, and he rose from his throne, smiling at the children. "Welcome, Jonathan and Timo, sons of Arba, nephews of Eba." At hearing their father's name, now mentioned by the king of the fairies, questions flooded their minds. But the king continued, "I am to Ormas, son of Hud, son of Powell. I am sure you have many questions, which my nephew Escaleb may answer in due time. But I am afraid I too have questions. How you came to our halls, and what drove you into the mountain." Jonathan recounted the story of their adventure from the start. The king found the finding of the great bow interesting and asked what it looked like and how the feathers of the arrows were arranged. He asked about the voices they heard and what they said. He seemed very concerned when Jonathan repeated the words, "I'll be needing it soon." Finally, he sat back in thought. After a while, he looked at the brothers with a concerned look. "Tales like yours are becoming more common in these days. I'm glad you found the safety of our halls while they remain safe." His gaze wandered off into the distance. A fairy entered the hall and approached the king. He looked nervous and out of breath. He whispered something into the king's ears, looked at the children with a strange look, and left. As he passed, the children realized he had only one ear. "My uncle and brother to the king," Escaleb whispered, and it seemed to the children that he found the situation rather amusing. They, however, were mortified and very much embarrassed at seeing the fairy they had tried to shoot. What happened next happened quickly. A terrible sound was heard that shook the very core of the mountain. Boom, boom, boom. It was answered by the blaring of bright horns, as if to counter the terrible noise. The king and all who sat in the room quickly stood to their feet. A man ran into the room, and the children recognized him immediately. It was their uncle. Eber ran to the king and quickly bowed. "My lord, trolls have reached the northern gate. They are many and bring with them large rams to destroy your gates. If you are to leave, it must be soon." He scanned the room, and when his eyes fell on Jonathan and Timo, he cried aloud in shock. "My boys, what are you doing here?" And running over to them, he knelt and embraced them. His face was full of fear. He turned to the king. "My lord, I must apologize for my nephew's intrusion. I take full responsibility for their arrival." "No apologies are needed," said the king. "We knew the trolls were gathering in numbers, but we thought we would have more time. We must leave these halls tonight. A dark day indeed for the fairies. As for your responsibility, that is now to your nephews. I bid you take them home via the west tunnel. It will be safe for a day, maybe two. Our gates will hold at least that long. We will take the east road to distant lands. When the trolls break in, they will find our halls empty." His face looked sad and deeply troubled. "Why don't they stay and fight?" Jonathan whispered to Timo. The king heard. "We will not fight our brothers." The children stood confused. Eber bowed to the king. "Thank you, my lord. Well go," and taking Jonathan and Timo by the hand, led them swiftly out of the room. They turned corners and went down passageways. It seemed that Eber knew his way well in these tunnels. The children's minds were full of questions, but the worried expression on their uncle's face told them that they would have to wait. The terrible booming could still be heard, and the walls of the mountain shook. "What is that?" asked Jonathan. "The trolls are ramming the northern gates," said Eber, scanning the passageways to his left and right, trying to remember the way to the western tunnel. "You should not be here at such a time as this." He shook his head, but knew that this was partially his fault. He had encouraged their adventurous spirits, teaching them to track, hunt, and survive. Perhaps he knew a day like this was coming and wanted to prepare his brother's children for the test. After a short while of journeying, they came to a small passageway lit by small torches. Above it read, "The Western Way," in Fairish, the language of the fairies. Here they paused and ate some food from Timo's emergency survival kit. Timo also passed around his water skin, which Jonathan and Eber gladly received. "Always prepared, I see," grinned Eber, showing some of the pride he felt for his nephews. There were some fairies standing guard by the Western Way, and being told to expect Eber and his nephews, had prepared the three travelers some supplies for their journey, including fresh torches, a small bundle of timber for fire, and some food. After a brief pause, they began the journey down the Western Way. It was a single passageway crudely cut into the stone. They turned and meandered down the passage, noticing at times streams of gold and silver that the path curved to avoid. After a while, Eber noticed that his nephews were tiring, as the sun had gone down many hours ago outside the mountain. They came to a wider section of the tunnel, and Eber felt that this was as good a place as any to get some sleep. They built a small fire and curled up beside it. The children had waited for what seemed like an eternity to have their questions answered, and they could wait no longer. It was Jonathan who spoke first. "How do you know about the fairies? And you said trolls weren't real. And how do you know about the king? And why did the king say He wouldn't fight his brothers, and—" "Jonathan, Jonathan," Eber interrupted, knowing his nephews would be full of questions. "Now seems like the time to tell you the truth of this world." The children sat up and looked intently at their uncle. He was staring into the small fire and prodding it with a stick. "Many, many years ago there was a great fairy called Veru. He led the northern clan of fairies, and they lived above mountains, not under them like their brothers. He was a good fairy and took care of the mountains. But one day he found the Doomstone." "What's the Doomstone?" asked Timo, shuddering at the sound of it. "An object of evil, created before the time of fairies and men for stronger minds to use. It twisted the heart, mind, and body of Veru, and he became the first troll. One by one, all the fairies of the north were corrupted. They moved high into the northern mountains, and have for the most part stayed there, out of the way of fairies and men. Occasionally, they would raid the villages in the foothills or the tunnels under the mountains, but it has been a long time since we heard of them. That was until your father went missing." The children now paid even closer attention. Their father had gone missing when they were younger, and it had caused their mother great pain. They missed their father, but were so young at the time they had also forgotten most of what they knew of him. Your father heard rumors that the trolls had returned and were growing in numbers. He went to find more information, but never returned. He paused and looked into the faces of his nephews, his eyes filled with tears. "I did what I could. I tried to make you strong, able to look after yourselves, protect you from the truth until you were old enough. I thought you would have more time, but it seems the king of the trolls is wanting to expand his kingdom, and now he attacks the mountain." "Can't the fairies just stay? Lock the doors?" asked Timo. "The fairies could last a long while here in their halls," Eber answered. "When your walls are mountain, your house is strong, but eventually their strength would fail, and the trolls would prevail. The fairies know this, so they leave." There was a long pause. "Is father alive?" asked Jonathan quietly, not looking at his uncle. "I do not know," replied Eber. "Your father is a strong man, but he was delving into dangerous waters. I went looking for him, and that's when I found the fairies. I helped one of their scouts escape from a troll, and they welcomed me into their kingdom, a rare honor. But I did not find your father." He could not look the children in the eyes. "What happened to the Doomstone?" asked Jonathan, trying to steer the conversation away from the painful subject of his father. "No one knows," replied Eber. "It may not even be real, just a story to make sense of the trolls." "If it was found, could it be destroyed? Would the trolls become fairies again?" Timo asked. "I do not think so," replied Eber. "No, the damage is long done, and the trolls are evil. They are beyond repair. Though some still believe, including the king I might add, that the healing waters of the mountain can break the curse. But alas, they have not been found." "What are the healing waters?" the children asked together. "Legend tells that before time the builders of the mountain made a well of pure light, filled with the water of creation that could heal any disease and break any curse. The fairies have searched long for such a well. I do not believe it exists. But we must sleep. I will wake you in a few hours, and we must journey on again. The gates of the fairies will hold for a while, but not forever. I want to be long gone before they break through." Timo had one last question. "Why did they call us Child of Man?" His uncle looked at his nephews with a strange look. "Some fairies believe in an old prophecy, more of a nursery rhyme if you ask me, where a child of man will bring peace to the fairies. It seems your coming on such a day as when the trolls attacked the gates brought back this old tale to their minds. Think nothing of it. They lay down and almost immediately fell into a deep and troubled sleep. Timo dreamt. In his dream, he was back in the king's chamber, but it was different. Where a large statue stood in the real throne room, instead there stood a small door. Timo felt drawn to the door. He reached out his hand, and the door opened on its own. Walking through, he saw a stairway winding down into the depths of the mountain. As he followed the steps, a great light grew until he could not stand its brightness. He felt warm, strong, at peace, healed. He woke up. The next morning was long and tiresome. Timo pondered the meaning of his dream the night before, but kept it to himself. He felt as though he was being called back into the mountain, but that would be silly and dangerous. The western way continued to wind through the mountains. It was the longest way out from the fairies' kingdom, but the safest. They had used up the torches they had been given by the fairies the evening before, and were now using Timo's sap-dipped rags from his emergency survival kit. When Timo had produced these, Erba had laughed a good while, shaking his head in amazement. These burnt brighter and much longer than the oil torches of the fairies, which Timo noticed and was quite proud of. They still had quite a ways to go before reaching the western gate of the mountain. The children were worried about their mother and how she would be feeling, and Erba tried keeping them distracted with tales from his own adventures with the fairies, but it helped little. As midday arrived, or what they guessed was midday, they came to a large cave with its own stalagmites and stalactites. It reminded them of the king's chamber, but far less magnificent. They made another small fire with the remaining sticks and laid down. "Not too long now," said Erba, putting out the torch to save it. They had 5 rags left to make more, plenty for the rest of the journey. "We should reach the door within a few hours, but I can't go any further. You two have shown your strength today." He lay down and fell asleep. Jonathan was next to fall asleep, but Timo stayed awake, staring into the fire, his thoughts full of his dreams and the stories of his uncle. What was down the passageway? Eventually, he fell asleep. In his dream, he found himself in the king's throne room again. Once again, the doorway called to him from where a statue stood in the king's real chamber. Once again, he followed the stairs down into the mountain, and once again found the great light. This time, it was even brighter, and as he reached the source of the light, he found himself standing in front of a small well. He awoke. He looked at his uncle and brother, who were fast asleep. The fire had only burned a little. He must have only just fallen asleep. But he knew what he needed to do, or at least felt as though he needed to do. He must find that passage and see the light. He reckoned it was calling to him for a reason. Perhaps he was the child of man. At the very least, he was a child of a man. Without thinking too much, he stood up and quietly put his bag on his back. His mind was made. Back to the fairy halls. He laid on the ground 2 of his sap-soaked torch rags so his uncle and brother could safely make the rest of the journey out of the mountain. He softly tiptoed to the path leading out of the mountain and left on the ground a piece of chewed flower gum. Hopefully his uncle would guess he had ventured further out of the mountain and not back into it. He reckoned they had been walking for about 8 hours since leaving the fairy halls. If his uncle kept sleeping a while and guessed wrong about Timo's direction, he may reach the halls before his uncle caught up. If he was caught, he would be in a lot of trouble. Timo then crept around his sleeping uncle and brother, and with a brief glance over his shoulder, he stole into the dark passage that led back into the fairy halls. He felt his way for a while in the dark before taking out a torch and lighting it with his flint and steel. Then, with all the energy he could muster, he picked up his pace to a light run. Timo was very fit but could not run for 8 hours without rest, but he would need a good head start, a great deal of pace, and a pinch of luck if he wished to outrun his uncle. After some time, Timo could not run any further and slowed to a walk. He took out some scraps of bread he still had and ate on the move. When he felt rested enough, he started jogging again. The path seemed to fly by and Timo lost track of time. His legs were sore, but his heart was set on his journey. He tried not to think about what he was doing. It only made him want to turn back. He ran on. When his uncle woke about an hour later and noticed Timo had gone, he quickly woke Jonathan and they scoured the cave, calling out Timo's name without any reply. Erba knew that he had not been captured by the trolls, as they could not have reached them by then, and why take only Timo when all three had been sleeping? For some unknown reason, Timo must have left on his own. But in what direction? Surely Timo would not be returning back into the mountain. "He left us 2 torch rags," said Jonathan, holding up the sap-soaked cloths. "He must have left it so we could follow him." Erba did not respond. Soon the flower gum was found on the ground, and Erba guessed that Timo had ventured further out of the mountain. Jonathan was not so sure, but went along with his uncle. They slowly followed the path leading westwards, making sure they didn't miss any signs that Timo had been down that way. After an hour of walking, they came to another wider cave, and an underground stream flowed ever so slowly through. The ground here was different. Not the solid rock of the mountain, but a light sand, piled by the stream over countless years of its flowing. In the sandy floor, they found tracks of fairies who had passed through over many years, but they were old tracks. No sign was found that a young boy with small feet had walked through this part of the tunnel. Erba's heart sank. Why would Timo be turning back into the mountain? I should not have told him about the prophecy. He picked up Jonathan, placed him on his shoulders, and started running back from where they came. Jonathan was silent and could see the fear in his uncle's eyes. After a while, Jonathan had to walk as the ceiling of the tunnel was too low to allow him to be carried. Then their first torch went out. One left. Erba quickly lit the last torch left by Timo, and they hurried along the path. After a short while, they arrived back at their campsite and continued further down the tunnel. Still no sign of Timo. Jonathan could run faster than Timo, but not as fast as his uncle. But Erba would not leave Jonathan behind in the dark to catch up quicker. They ran on, and when Jonathan tired, Erba picked him up, placed him on his back, and ran further, but now slower. Then, just as they were feeling as though they were making progress, the final torch went out. They were in complete darkness. Luckily for them, they knew that the tunnel did not part and continued on relatively straight until it reached the fairies' halls. But all they could do now was walk slowly forward, using the tunnel walls to guide them. They would no longer catch Timo before he reached the fairy halls. They could only hope that the trolls had not broken through already, and in the light of the halls they could find Timo and get some head start on the trolls who would inevitably break through. Meanwhile, Timo pressed on, his legs burning from the fast pace he was keeping. Sometimes he ran, sometimes he walked, but he never fully stopped. Eventually he could go no further without a rest. He sat down and unwillingly fell asleep. Once again he dreamt of the king's chamber and the tunnels of light. He was awoken by the terrible sound of the trolls' battering rams, still trying to break through the strong stone mountain gates. He was getting closer, and after his latest dream, his heart more adamant than ever on his mission. Standing up, he lit his last torch and started to run. The rest had done him good, and he was able to move at a good pace. The path started to wind around the familiar streams of gold and silver, and Timo thought that he recognized some of the formations on either side. Eventually, though, his torch was exhausted, but instead of finding himself in darkness, as his uncle and brother had found themselves, he instead saw a glow coming from the path ahead. He had made it back to the fairy halls. Timo came to the small archway that began the western way. The paths of the fairies were much darker now, with many of the wall torches burnt out. Nevertheless, Timo could find his way comfortably. He slowly made his way through the tunnels as best as he could remember. He often found himself walking into rooms with no exits, and had to backtrack to find the right path to the throne room. Still, the booming continued, but perhaps now more sporadic. Perhaps the trolls were getting tired, or perhaps they were breaking through. Timo did not want to be around to find out. He walked through a corridor that looked familiar, and that led him to a large set of well-carved stairs. The stairs to the throne room. He crept up cautiously and entered the king's chamber. It was mostly dark, as the lanterns in this room had nearly all died out. Timo found some fuel and set them alight again. The room blazed with a new-found light, and Timo took in his surroundings. The room did not seem as grand without its furniture and beautiful wall hangings, and without the fairy king seated upon his throne. Timo walked over to the large statue of an old fairy king. He looked noble and proud, just like Tuomas. This was where, in Timo's dream, he had seen the door, but no door could be found. Timo searched the room, but there were no passageways that led from the chamber except to go back down the stairs. After a good while, Timo sat down next to the statue and started to question if he had made the right choice in returning to the mountain. "What have I done?" he thought, and he laid his head on his knees. Just then, something caught Timo's eye. Very small and hidden from view, unless you were very low to the ground and sitting right next to the statue, was a marking carved into the limestone base of the statue. 2 curved lines running parallel like waves of water. Timo stared at the discovery. Without thinking much, he ran his finger over the lines, tracing out the waves. Suddenly, the lines shone with bright blue flames, and Timo heard a noise of rock scraping over stone. The statue was moving. Within seconds, the statue was roughly 3 paces to the left, and a stone door was uncovered. Timo's heart started beating faster, and he looked around the room to see if he was still alone. He was, and all was quiet. Quiet! Timo realized he had not heard the booming banging of the trolls and could not remember how long it had been silent. He must be fast. They might be coming. He reached out and grasped a small silver ring that was attached to the door. With a large heave, he drew it open and was met with a chilling blast of ice-cold air and a darkness blacker than black. He had half expected the blinding light from his dream, but instead he could barely see but a few paces where a stair began to wind its way into the mountain depths. Timo picked up the torch he had placed down and, holding it before him, gazed into the darkness. The stairs were narrow but well made and wound down through walls lined with crystal and limestone formations. Timo stepped through the doorway. It was very cold. He started down the stairs, the flame from his torch providing just enough light to see the steps in front of him. Something in the passage seemed to draw the light into itself and made the going difficult. Timo's feet missed a step and he crashed down, scraping his elbows against the cold stairs until his hand steadied him. He was lucky that the torch had not gone out. Further, he continued down the stairs, now cradling his left elbow that was bruised and grazed. After what felt like hundreds of steps, Timo came to a flat landing. He could not see how large the room was, as the light from his torch did not reach its walls. The floor, polished flat, extended from Timo into the darkness, broken only by a thin stream of mountain water trickling across the floor and then down again into unknown depths. Timo was tired and sat down by the stream. His run through the mountains, little food, and even less sleep had left him exhausted, and his elbow throbbed with pain. He pulled out his water skin and, lifting it to his mouth, found that it was empty. He leaned over and filled it from the small stream and drank. The water was cold and refreshing, and he drank deep. He took in his surroundings. This was very different to his dreams, with no light, no warmth, and no well. Why had he come here? Why the secret door? After refilling his water skin, he stood up and listened, for he thought he had heard something coming from above. He crept closer to the stairs, and again he heard the sound. Someone or something was coming down the stairs. As he had done before when seeing the trolls at the cave entrance, Timo smothered his torch and once again found himself in complete darkness. He waited. Again he heard noises, footsteps, fast footsteps, as if someone was in a hurry. He slowly crawled his way to the side of the room, away from the stairway. His arm had stopped throbbing. The footsteps grew closer, and it came with the light of torches. Timo's mind pictured hordes of trolls pouring into the mountain and down the stairs. Surely they would catch him, alone and in the dark, helpless. Suddenly from the stairwell came two figures holding torches. Timo recognized them. It was his uncle and brother. "Timo," whispered Eber quietly, not wanting to raise his voice too loud. He sounded worried. "Uncle!" Timo ran to his uncle, who knelt down, held Timo by his shoulders, and looked intently in his eyes. "What were you thinking?" he asked. "Do you know how much danger you have put us in? The trolls have broken through, and even now they storm the mountain. We will be lucky if we escape." He sighed. Timo could only gaze at the floor. He wanted to explain himself, tell his uncle his dreams, but all he could do was stare at the ground. "Come," Eber said calmly. "We must be quick." He took Timo by the hand and they ran up the stairs. Timo's mind was racing as fast as his body, and glancing over at his brother, he saw a worried look on Jonathan's face. Jonathan and Timo loved adventures, but this was becoming much more than an adventure. Never before had their lives been in such danger. They ran up and on. Reaching the top of the stairs, Eber paused and peered through the doorway behind the statue. The room was still and empty. "They will be looking for the throne room," said Eber. "It will give them great pleasure to sit in the king's chair. We must get out now." They darted across the room and down the stairs, hearing the statue moving behind them, sealing the secret passageway. At the bottom, they turned left and continued down the passageways, now very dark, as only a few fairy torches remained alight. As new passageways opened on either side, they paused to make sure nothing was approaching, then pressed on. After running down a narrow corridor that ran through larger halls, they paused as the path now forked into many directions. From some, they heard the sound of running feet, the clanging of metal armor, and saw the red glow of torches. Trolls were approaching. Eber led the children down the center path that remained silent and dark. After a while, they heard a great rumble of feet behind them, as the trolls took the same path. Turning from the present road, Jonathan asked, "How long to the western way?" "A while still," said Eber. "We have had to take the long way to avoid the trolls. Keep going." Suddenly, as they rounded a bend, a very large troll turned around the same bend, and they crashed into each other. Fortunately, the troll fell backwards and hit his head on the hard floor, knocking it unconscious. As they ran past, Timo looked at the beast. It was large, taller than a fairy, and had horrible brown and blue skin. Its mouth was full of misshapen teeth, and its ears were sharp and bent. How was this monster once a brother to the fairies? "Hurry, hurry! They must have taken the northern paths that lead in this direction." Eber looked worried and urged his nephews on. After what seemed an eternity, they reached the western way, and not a minute too soon. Behind them, they heard the trolls closing in, only a few hundred paces away. "Quickly, down the tunnel," Eber said as he let the children go first. If any trolls were to follow, they would have to deal with him first. He had picked up the sword the unconscious troll had been carrying and would not let anything happen to his nephews without a fight. They ran down the western way with all the speed they could muster, passing the bright streams of gold that the trolls would undoubtedly take for their own. After a long while, without stopping, they paused to catch their breath and listen if they had been followed. They had not, and they breathed sighs of relief. Timo burst into tears. "Sorry, Uncle," he cried. I thought if I went back I would..." His apology was cut short. Their torch had gone out, and in front of them, in the very direction they were going, a light could be seen, and it was getting brighter. They heard a horrible laugh coming from the direction of the light. They were trapped. Something approaching from ahead and trolls in the halls behind. Caught between rock and a troll's place, Eber decided that there couldn't possibly be more trolls ahead than there were back in the fairy halls. Forward was their best chance at escape. If they had to, they would fight their way out. He told the children to wait where they were and crept forward, alone towards the glowing light. He stopped and turned. "If I don't come back, well, let's hope I come back." Timo and Jonathan waited in the silent dark, not daring to talk, listening intently for any noises ahead. They were extremely anxious. If their uncle was captured, or worse, what could they do? Run back to the troll-infested mountain? Trying to stand their ground and fight would be utterly hopeless. Their only chance was if Eber could defeat the trolls ahead and come back for them. Soon there was a great sound of fighting. Clashes of steel against steel, bodies against rock and floor, cries of pain and anger, and then silence. The boys, crouching to the floor, peered into the tunnel ahead, its dim light now growing very close. Had their uncle been victorious? Was he now approaching to see them to safety? Soon they heard footsteps, multiple footsteps, and they knew their uncle had not overcome the trolls. They turned and ran, but could not go far in the dark. Soon large hands reached from the dark behind them and snatched them up. They had been caught, and a voice spoke to them. It was cold and dark, and they recognized it immediately. "Well, if it isn't our little thieves." Timo and Jonathan were thrown to the ground and found themselves surrounded by a group of trolls. They were large and in the light of their torches looked altogether horrid. Their muddy blue skin looked as if it were covered in boils, and their smell filled the passageway so that Timo and Jonathan both gagged. "What have you done to our uncle?" asked Jonathan defiantly, mustering all the courage he could. "He'll be all right," snarled the troll. "For now, at least." And there came a horrible laughter from the trolls as their uncle was dragged to the center of the group and thrown carelessly to the floor. He was alive, but unconscious, and had large cuts above his left eye and across his cheekbone. Looking around at the trolls, Timo noticed a few were nursing wounds to their arms and bodies. Eber had given them a good fight. "He'll soon be in the king's prison," snarled the familiar voice, who bent down and looked at his prisoners. "The first of many, I shouldn't wonder. Quite the honor." He laughed through a cold grin, and standing up he barked orders to the other trolls. "You two, when we get back to the gate, head down. You'll find somewhere there to make our prison. Those fairy fools didn't build 'em, so we'll have to make do. As for these two..." He turned and looked at the children. "These two are going straight to the king." They all stood and started making their way back to the fairy halls. They moved at a fast pace. At the streams of gold and silver they paused, and the trolls gazed in wonder at the wealth of the mountain.
Stupid fairies didn't know what they were sitting on.
They laughed and ran on. At the entrance to the western way, the group parted. Most took Eber, who was still unconscious, and dragged him off in one direction. Jonathan reached out to grab his uncle, trying desperately to keep the three together, but his actions were met with a troll fist to the face. He stumbled back with a fresh cut below his right eye. 2 trolls remained with the brothers, and they sat down and started eating something from their pockets. The brothers looked on in disgust. They began to sit down, but the smaller troll looked at them and spat.
You stand.
The boys backed off and stood against the wall. Timo, nervous and cold, was rubbing his arm with his hands, trying to warm himself, when he realized something. Not only had his elbow stopped hurting, but there was no longer any cut, scrape, or bruise. It was completely healed. He stared at his elbow, wondering what this meant. Had he indeed found the healing waters of the mountain? But he had found no well and no light, just a trickle of water coming from some unknown mountain spring. He had to find out for sure, and looking at his brother and the cut below his eye, he had an idea. The trolls had taken his pack along with his water skin and emergency survival kit, and it now laid between the 2 trolls.
"Excuse me," said Timo. "We are tired and have had no water. May we drink some from my water skin?"
He was met with blank stares from the trolls. The largest troll, who they had come to realize was the owner of the bow they had borrowed, picked up Timo's pack and opened it.
You mean this water skin?
He smirked, and taking the water skin, he took a large drink. The effect was immediate. Once the troll had drunk, he took in a large and fast breath, as if he had been drowning and had only reached the water's surface in time. He stared at Timo and did not speak. The other troll paid no attention. It seemed to Timo that something about the troll had immediately changed. He still looked and smelt like a troll, but his skin was not so muddy, and his face not so cruel. The troll looked at his partner, who was finishing his meal, some form of meaty bread that looked disgusting. Then he looked back to Timo, then to the water skin in his hand.
Go,
he said to the other troll.
Go tell the king what we found.
Why? The harsher voiced troll replied.
So you'll get all the reward for the capture?
Tell him you caught him. I don't need no reward. The smaller troll smiled and ran off, leaving him alone with the 2 brothers. He waited until there was silence, then turned to Timo. What have you done to me? He asked quietly.
I'm sorry,
Timo started, not knowing what to say, but not wanting to anger the troll. Do not apologize, said the troll. He was deep in thought, and after a pause he asked, What is this? He held up Timo's water skin.
Water?
Replied Timo, not fully realizing what was taking place.
What do you mean?
I can see color. The troll paused and gazed into his torch. I have never seen color. Jonathan watched on, perplexed. What is this? He asked again.
What water from?
Timo hesitated, not wanting to give away too much information. From?
Timo sighed. I found water in a secret room, down a secret stair.
This is not water, replied the troll.
I had a dream of stairs of light and a well. I followed it and found the water. My uncle told us of the healing waters of the mountain that could heal any disease and break any curse. I went looking for it, and maybe
troll sat still, now staring at the floor. What the children could not see, nor the troll understand, was the change that had taken place within his heart and mind. He had been utterly transformed. He had been born a troll and had only ever had a troll's thoughts, dark and hopeless. Seeing color was a shock, but something he could define. Feeling no hate or fear was something altogether foreign to him, and he could not understand it. For the first time in his life, he felt free. Not that he had been aware of his captivity, but drinking the healing waters had lifted a heaviness over his heart that had been ever present but never noticed. Jonathan was starting to realize what was happening, but was still fearful of their predicament.
"What will you do to us?"
he asked. The troll sat still, not heeding the question. Presently the smaller troll returned.
Hurry up, the king's waiting.
The larger troll looked up at his partner and then at Timo, whose eyes now fell on his water skin and back to the troll, as if trying to say something. Taking the water skin, the troll held it up.
Take a swig of this. Tell me what you think.
The other troll had no reason not to trust his partner and grabbed the water skin with a smirk, believing some mischief was afoot. No sooner had he gulped down the waters than he stumbled back, looked at the larger troll, then to the boys, paused, and fell to the floor. After a while, Timo was amazed to see that he was crying. The other troll looked on in amazement. Trolls never cried. This particular troll had hurt many, and had many hurts. His breaking was his healing, as years of torment and hatred were stripped off him. After some time he sat up and was quiet, trying to make sense of what had happened. He found healing water, said the larger troll, pointing to Timo. All trolls need this. We will tell the king. The other troll sat still, and after a long pause, he nodded. They both stood and gathered their things. The larger troll handed Timo his pack, and looking at the boys, he said, I am Bold. He is Maggot.
Timo and Jonathan.
Bold nodded. They started walking, slowly now, and Timo and Jonathan were led through the mountain. They could hear the two trolls talking quietly behind them, but they could not make out their conversation. Timo went through his pack and felt his water skin. It was still quite full, and he knew where he could find more. They were led down many passageways, and often the trolls paused and discussed which way to go, as they themselves were not familiar with the layout of the mountain. Soon they came to a large and bright room, lit with large cauldrons of burning fire tree sap. They burned bright and hot and illuminated the space. Here the fairies had not had time to take down their tapestries and pack their carpets, and the room still looked quite beautiful. To the children's surprise, they had been led to the new dungeons of the trolls, and there, in a hastily made cage of steel, lay their uncle, no longer unconscious, but his wounds now looking worse. Bold motioned to Timo to go to his uncle, and walked over to the troll guard who sat at a nearby table, unsure of what was happening. Timo gave his uncle a drink from the flask, which the troll guard objected to. Wait, said Bold. It seemed he commanded some respect among the trolls, and the other troll waited. He then beckoned to Timo to give him the water skin. Holding it to the guard, he simply said, Drink. Just as Bold and Maggot had been healed, so was the troll guard. He sat at his table and laughed, looking around and taking in his new world of color. Stay here, said Bold to the guard. Say nothing to no one about this until we tell the king. The guard nodded, still in disbelief and in his own way making sense of his new freedom. Ebba was now sitting and fully healed of his wounds. Only scars could be seen where once were terrible gashes. He himself was completely perplexed as he watched his nephews looking relatively at ease and standing free among the trolls. Maggot opened the cage and let Erba out. He ran to his nephews.
"What is happening?"
he asked in amazement.
"I found the waters,"
said Timo.
"The trolls are being healed."
Erba kneeled before his nephews in disbelief, gazing at the trolls, then back to Timo and Jonathan, and felt the scars on his head.
"You two are something special."
Bold took ropes and bound the 3 humans. "For your safety," he said, and they reluctantly accepted their binding. The trolls led them back into the tunnels. Erba was suspicious, but had no other choice but to be led through the mountain by the trolls, who were still heavily armed, holding long swords of blackened steel. They passed many trolls, who laughed and jeered at the 3. If any got too close, Bold stepped forward, growling at them, saying, "These are for the king." After a while, they reached the long staircase that led to the king's chamber. "Do not speak to the king," said Bold. "I cannot protect you in here." He led them up the stairs, and they entered the king's chamber. They were met with a horrible smell that now even Bold and Maggot seemed to detest. The trolls had smashed the fairy king's throne and erected a large black chair of stone where the old throne had once stood. The room was filled with large cauldrons of burning fire, and it seemed the smell was coming from leftovers of what only trolls would consider a feast. Timo looked across to where the hidden door stood. It had not been discovered, but the statue's head had been knocked off and destroyed. In the room stood perhaps 20 large trolls, wearing black armor and holding spears and swords. They stared at Erba and the children as they entered and spat on the floor as they walked past. Sitting on the throne was a very, very large troll. He looked both fat and strong, and in his hand he held a 2-pronged spear. Above his head he wore a crown of rock. It was blood red and seemed to produce its own light from within. He smiled at the children as if eyeing his next meal. He held up his hand, and the room fell silent. "Ah, our first lucky prisoners. But why are men and children in the mountain when all fairy filth have left?" Bold stepped forward. "My king, we came here through the western tunnel and found these 3 trying to escape. We do not know why they were in the mountain, but we bring them to you now. They have something that belongs to you, for everything under the mountain is now yours." He was careful with his words, trying to pique the king's interest, pandering to his pride and not raise suspicion. He was not sure if the king would readily drink of the water skin. Trolls are not trusting creatures, and it was not uncommon for an ambitious troll to try and take the throne. The king may feel he was being offered poison. The troll king leaned forward. His interest had indeed been piqued. "What have they of mine? I demand it now!" Bold stepped forward and handed to the king Timo's water skin and stepped back, bowing low to the ground. The king looked at the water skin and then to Bold. He did not look pleased. "What is this?" he asked, sounding most irritated. "Do you insult me on the day of my victory? No, my king. I give you the power to heal your people on such a day as this." The king opened the water skin and smelt it. Then, staring at Bold, he proceeded to pour it out onto the floor. "We don't need healing," the king said quietly. "My king," begged Bold, "these waters have power. I see color, and I now know we have all carried a burden we need not. You must trust me." "Trust you?" the king spat. "You have always wanted my crown, Bold. Should I be so stupid to drink your poison? Away from me, all of you. I will deal with you later. For today I celebrate my victory under the mountain." He waved his hand, and many of the large trolls took Bold, Maggot, Erba and the children and led them out of the throne room. The captured offered no resistance. They were led with heavy hearts down the passageways and thrown back into the troll's prison. A new guard was on duty, and he was not delicate with the prisoners. He grabbed Timo by the hair and tossed him in a cage. He did the same with all of them, including Bold and Maggot. Each had a cage, and each felt utterly dismayed.
What do we do now?
Asked Timo, looking around at both his uncle and Bold, who he now trusted a little. Bold sat silently, contemplating the situation. Eber looked across and sighed. There is little we can do. Timo and Jonathan looked at each other, and then to their uncle, who they had never seen in such a state. Hopeless.
We can break out, they said. Pick the lock, make a run for it.
There's no way out now, said Bold. These are troll cages. They do not open easily. He looked at them with a look they had not yet seen on any of the trolls' faces. Kindness. I will do what I can. We must be patient. Hours had passed, and still the captives sat in their cages. They were hungry and thirsty and tired. Timo and Jonathan had tried to crawl up on the hard ground and sleep, but sleep did not find them. Trolls had come and gone and taken away the carpets and the tapestries hanging on the walls. These they had carried off and burnt for warmth. The room was now plain and smelled of troll, with the fires now burned low, leaving the room in near darkness. Jonathan looked at his brother, who was trying to sleep. "Psst," he whispered, and Timo turned around. "How do you feel?"
Not good,
replied Timo.
Oh, this is all my fault. Why did I go back? Nothing you can do now. Anyways, who knows if we would have run into those trolls anyway?
He looked over at Bold, who had fallen asleep, he being used to sleeping in uncomfortable places.
Do you trust him?
Jonathan asked.
I don't know, said Timo. Maybe. That water did something, and it healed my arm and Uncle's cuts. But what can he do now?
Just then, the door to the room opened. "Change of shifts," said a troll as he walked into the room. "Already?" questioned the guard on duty. "You want a break or not? I could go back to bed," said the new troll. "Whatever," grunted the guard, and he left the room. The new guard closed the door and walked over to the fire, now smouldering in the corner of the room. He put some more fuel into it, and it came back to life. Then he turned around. To the children's surprise, it was the troll who had been guarding their uncle, the same troll who had drunk the healing waters and was told not to tell anyone. He walked over to the cage and smiled. "Hello, little idiots," he said with a grin. His healing had obviously not helped his language nor his manners. At the sound of his voice, Bold and Maggot awoke. "Nothing! Nothing!" they cried. Yes, nothing is here," said the troll. "Time to get you out of these boxes." Timo and Jonathan were confused. "Nothing?" asked Jonathan. "Yes," replied the troll.
What is nothing?"
"I am nothing," said the troll.
"You are something,"
said Timo. "Of course I am. So are you. But I am also nothing." He smiled. "It is my name. And now that I say it, I come to find I do not like it. For you are correct. I am something indeed." There was something about this troll that the boys liked. Nothing unlocked and opened their cages, and they gladly stepped out into freedom. "I do not know what it was you gave me, Bold," said Nothing, "but I have never felt this way. Look at me helping humans." He shook his head, still coming to terms with his own freedom. Once freed, a hearty discussion took place between Bold, Maggot, and Eber as to what to do next. Nothing kept mostly quiet. Should they try and escape? And if so, in what direction? Should they try to fight? No, that would be hopeless. Or should they try and convince the king of the power of the mountain waters? Ebba was in favor of escape, while Bold's and Maggot's hearts were with their people. Me and my nephews cannot stay here, argued Ebba. We must try and find an exit.
You cannot escape, interrupted Nothing. There are now many trolls at every entrance and exit, every cave and every tunnel. The king believes the fairies will return in greater numbers and try and retake what we took. He cannot believe that they would just go and give up their halls without a fight. So he has ordered the mountain be made secure for trolls.
There was a long pause as Ebba thought this over.
The trolls must drink, said Bold. The king must drink. It is the only way.
But he poured out the last of the waters, said Ebba, and I doubt we will be able to get any more. He looked across to his nephews.
The children might be able to slip by at night, said Bold, looking over at them. They are small and quiet.
With that there was great objection from Ebba. I am not sending my nephews back to that room. They will be killed.
Your nephews will be eaten in the morning. They are their own only hope. And ours.
There was silence. Jonathan spoke.
Uncle, let us try. I think I could lead us back to the throne room. We could sneak down the stairs and get more water. I don't want to wait here for the king to come back.
Ebba sat defeated. Sending his young nephews into troll-infested halls and passageways was the last thing he wanted to do. But letting them sit in a troll cage until something worse happened was no better option. He spoke quietly to the 3 trolls, and the children could not hear what they discussed. It seemed they were devising a plan. Okay, he said quietly, and knelt down by Jonathan and Timo, grasping their hands. Okay, if it is the only way. Go quietly, go quickly. Get the water. He handed them a troll water skin from nearby. Get the water and come back here as fast as you can. Don't try to be heroes. What you are doing is heroic enough. Don't seek out trolls to heal. When you return, we will go together and heal as many as we can. Eventually, the king must listen or be overthrown. We will force him to drink if needed, but that won't happen if you get caught. Get the water, come back. He stared at his nephews and waited for them to show their understanding. They both nodded, and after embracing their uncle and confirming the directions with him to the throne room, they left the prison quietly. The passageways were dark, as many of the new troll lanterns had burnt low. They had taken the mountain so quickly they had not the time to bring with them fuel to keep the mountain halls ever bright, and they were all now sleeping, leaving the fires unattended. Timo and Jonathan crept quietly down the mountain tunnels. They still seemed clean and fairy-ish, but now and again they came across evidence that these tunnels were now troll tunnels. Gashes along the walls, broken furniture, troll lanterns and food scraps left on the floor. They passed through familiar places and were heading in the right direction. They came to a large doorway, and sneaking through, they came across a room filled with trolls. But they were all asleep. The room stank, and the children could only hold their breath and back out of the room. What now? Jonathan asked. We need to go through there. Can we go around? Asked Timo. We might get lost, replied Jonathan, unsure of what to do. They decided that speed was needed, and it did seem that the trolls were fast asleep. They tiptoed into the room, as quiet as a forest mouse. They wound their way through large troll bodies, holding their noses as they went. As Timo neared a very fat troll, it rolled over, opened its eyes, stared right at Timo, and fell back to sleep. Timo's heart was racing so fast he could have fainted. Through the room they passed, and now on the outside they breathed breaths of relief. "On we go," said Jonathan. They continued down the dark, quiet passages until they reached the large stairs leading to the throne room. The white carpet leading up the stairs was now stained black with mud and other dirts. At the top of the stairs, the brothers peeked into the room. It was empty. The king must have found the fairy king's bedchamber and was sleeping there, but that did not give them much peace. They crept into the room, and Timo led Jonathan over to the statue. He pointed out the wavy lines and whispered with a slight grin, "Watch this." He passed his fingers over the lines, and once again they shone with a blue light, and the statue started moving. The sound of it rolling over stone was not quiet, and the boys were relieved when the statue finally stopped. They waited a minute to see if anything or anyone could be heard. It was still. They took a lantern hanging on a nearby wall, still with enough fuel to last a good while, and stepped through the secret door. Down they went, with Timo leading the way. The air was extremely cold, and the boys shivered as they walked. On and on the stairs delved into the mountain. When the boys reached the bottom, Timo held up the lantern and pointed out the small stream of water. "There it is," he said, pointing. "Is that it?" asked Jonathan. "I thought it would be more grand." They both knelt and drank from the water, using their hands as vessels. They had not been given any water and were very thirsty. Jonathan's cut healed instantly, and although they had no other sickness or injury, the healing waters did them good. They were refreshed and awake, feeling like they had only just woken from an excellent night's sleep. They filled up the water skin to its brim and started walking back up the stairs. Then they heard a sound.
"Who is sneaking in my throne room?"
snarled a voice. The children recognized it. The Troll King was coming down the stairs. The brothers ran back down to the bottom and desperately looked for a place to hide.
"I know the smell of you."
Timo and Jonathan looked at each other in dismay.
"And you still haven't put out your lantern."
The voice laughed. The lantern! How could they have been so stupid? Timo had thought quickly on his feet twice now concerning his torch, but this third time he had forgotten entirely. Timo went to put out the lantern, but Jonathan stopped him. "No, too late now," he said. "I'd rather see what's coming my way. And the king's coming with his own light anyway. Look!" He pointed up the stairs, and there was indeed a light growing brighter.
"You are going to be my main course at my celebration feast tomorrow,"
laughed the king.
"But a midnight snack will do just fine."
The king was now almost at the bottom of the stairs, and he continued making horrible jokes about how he would prepare their bodies for his feast. He had guessed correctly that the children were alone, as he did not smell adult and had met no resistance while descending the stairs. Unbeknownst to the children, he had sent his bodyguards back to the prisons to bring Eber, Bold, Maggot, and whoever had helped them escape back to his throne room, where he would hold court and punish them immediately. Stepping off the last stair, he held up his large torch. The room was filled with light, and before him, crouching beside the stream, were the two brothers. They were scared and rather helpless against the massive Troll King, who now towered over them. "Please, sir," begged Timo. "These are the healing waters. You just need to drink." The king laughed.
"Again with healing. Tell me, little ones, do I look sick? Do I look weak?"
And he stood even taller. The boys looked at each other, and with a glance, they knew what the other was thinking. They needed to try and make a run for it, knowing they stood no chance against the troll. At once they sprung up. Jonathan ran to the right of the king and Timo to the left, trying to keep a good distance to avoid being caught. But they were too slow. With one swoop, the troll caught Jonathan by the scruff of his neck and tossed him back across the room and across the small stream of healing waters. He then swung around and caught hold of Timo by the hair. Timo cried out in pain. The king turned to face Jonathan, and still holding Timo by his hair, he came upon him. Without thinking, Jonathan lunged forward towards the stream and splashed water all over the king. The troll stood still and dropped Timo, who scurried over and huddled next to his brother. The king stood frozen in place for a long time. He turned and sat at the base of the stairs. Time passed slowly, and the king said nothing. He sat quietly, looking at the floor, sometimes raising his eyes to the children or to the stream. Then, at length, he stood and walked over to the water, knelt and drank deeply. Then he rose and spoke calmly to the children. "I see now. Come." He stood, turned, and began walking up the stairs. The children followed him from a distance, not wanting to get too close. As they neared the top of the stairs, they began hearing noises coming from the throne room. It sounded as if the room was now filled with trolls, all shouting and roaring. And indeed the room was filled with trolls, all shouting and roaring. From the darkness at the top of the stairs, the king looked through the doorway and beheld his trolls. They stood against the walls, gnashing their teeth, angry and anxious for their king's arrival. Here he stood, and here the brokenness of his people was realized. He enjoyed being the king and the power that the crown gave him. He liked when his trolls feared him and cowered in his presence. But looking at them now, he beheld a lost people and realized he had not been the king they needed. Before he stepped out, he turned to the children. His face was very different. He seemed younger and kinder, and somehow less burdened. "We must be smart. I have not earned, nor do I deserve your trust. But you must follow my lead. If my trolls feel something is off, they will turn on us all." Timo and Jonathan nervously nodded, not knowing what the king meant by following his lead. Then swiftly the king grabbed the children by their necks and reefed them forward into the room. "Here are our thieves!" The king roared, and he threw the boys not so gently to the floor in front of him. Eber, who was now laying on the floor in chains, saw the children and the king, and his heart was broken. "Bind them," yelled the king, "and put them with the others." Large trolls stepped forward and bound the brothers. They sat them next to Eber, Bold, and Nothing, who now also lay chained on the floor. The captives looked on helplessly as the king rose and sat on his throne. "Here before us are 3 enemies of the trolls, and 3 traitors." There was a roar from the crowd. "Tell me, my brothers, what do we do to enemies and traitors?" "Kill them! Death! Away with them!" The crowd of trolls was in a frenzy and hungry for punishment. "They say the trolls need healing," the king continued, and the trolls laughed and jeered. "Do we look ill, my brothers? Do we look sick?" As he said this, the children noticed that his voice quavered, and for a moment he seemed to lose his strength. He shook himself. "I say they are the ones who need healing, and what better healing from life than death?" The crowd roared. The king raised his hand, and there was silence, and he spoke clearly. "For the crimes of thievery, trespassing, escaping capture, attacking the king, and betrayal." He stopped and looked at the prisoners. "The punishment is death." There rose, louder now, great cries of approval from the crowd, and they clapped and stamped their feet and roared and laughed and spat at the captives who sat hopelessly defeated. Timo and Jonathan felt they had been played by the king, who was now going to kill them. Once again, the king raised his hand.
Guards, prepare the room for the execution.
He motioned to his men, and some left the room.
But before our execution, I propose a toast to celebrate our victory over the fairy slime.
The trolls cheered. They needed no encouragement to drink. They all took large wooden mugs from the tables and stood around the room. The king then walked around and poured into each glass some clear fluid from a water skin. Timo and Jonathan glanced at each other, then to their uncle. Once the king had filled each mug, he walked back to his throne, and standing before it, he raised his vessel.
Well, boys, to what do we toast?
Victory!
Some called.
The mountain!
Yelled others. The king looked around the room and then to the captives, and through a cruel-looking smile, he said softly, "To healing." The room was filled with evil sniggering as they thought the king was insulting the captives. And as they raised their mugs and drank, so began the great healing of the trolls. Jonathan and Timo could not fully describe what happened next. The room was at first silent, then one by one, trolls started laughing or crying. Some were gazing around the room in wonder as their eyes saw color for the first time. Most just stood, coming to grips with what was happening. None of the captives could understand the depth of misery it was to be a troll. Forever angry, forever bitter, forever living in fear in a world of cold grey. And now free, without weight or burden. Once the king's guards had drunk from the healing waters, and Bold had explained all that had happened, the healing became faster. The king ordered large water skins to be filled, and he personally gave a drink to each troll. If some questioned him, believing it to be some trick, he ordered his guards to grab them, and he forced it down their throats. After all, he was still a troll. The healing under the mountain continued through the night, until every troll had drunk from the mountain's water. During this time, Timo, Jonathan, and Eber stood or sat and watched in awe. Eventually, they were led by Nothing to some comfortable fairy rooms the trolls had not yet dirtied.
You may sleep here tonight,
said Nothing.
And don't worry, no one will eat you while you sleep.
He laughed as he left the room, and although Eber and the children were not quite as pleased by his humor, they were exhausted and fell asleep quickly. When the children woke after many hours of sleep, they found themselves alone in the room. This troubled them, as the events from the previous night had not yet settled in their minds. But presently in walked Nothing, and with him he brought breakfast.
Good morning, little idiots,
he said with a grin, and then corrected himself.
Sorry, not idiots. Smart children you are indeed. Although only idiots venture back into a mountain full of trolls.
He looked at Timo and grinned again.
I hope I have found a suitable breakfast. The fairies did not leave much.
And with that he handed the children a platter of stale bread, cheese, cured meat, and some very ripe fruits. To the hungry children this was heaven, and they gobbled it up. "Where is Uncle?" they asked as they ate.
He awoke early and has been helping the king recall the fairies, answered Nothing. There is much work to do now. Much healing has happened, but still a greater healing awaits. The fairies have been called. They are coming back to the mountains.
"How did you reach them already?" asked Timo. "They must be miles away already."
We sent mountain sparrows,
replied Nothing.
Big ones, and they were not so far away. They took with them their belongings. Their going was slow.
"What will happen when they get back?" asked Jonathan. "They won't be happy."
No, and they needn't be.
said Nothing, who started packing up their empty breakfast plates.
This healing may take time.
After breakfast, Nothing led the children back to the king's throne room, and to their surprise it had been cleaned, or cleaned to the best of a troll's ability, and although it still smelt like troll, it smelled less of troll. There they met their uncle, who picked them both up, one on each shoulder. "Come, children," he said joyfully. "Something is about to happen that hasn't occurred in anyone's lifetime for 1,000 years." "What's happening?" asked the children with wonder. "The trolls and the fairies are meeting on the eastern meadows. It will be a day to remember." Eber carried the children through the mountain, and they left via the eastern road. It ran almost parallel to the secret passageway the children had found, except it turned northward at the end to bring them out of the mountains several miles north of the crack in the cliff. The going was fast, and before too long they found themselves exiting the mountain through large stone gates, and before them stood a sight to behold. The meadows before the mountain were green and vast, covered in beautiful flowers and clover. There was gathered a vast horde of trolls, and the children thought they still looked rather frightening, except they were not positioned like a great army, but rather were sitting in smaller circles, many talking or singing, some preparing food over large fires. Eber led the children to the base of a large hill on the eastern edge of the gathering, where they stopped and sat. On top of the hill, the children could see the Troll King, and beside him stood Bold. They were talking and pointing out into the distance. Presently, Nothing strolled over to the hill and sat beside the children.
"Chips?"
he asked, and held out a large bag of something that was definitely not chips. No, thank you," said Timo, who did not want to lose his breakfast. After hours of patiently waiting, they heard from the east a distant blaring of horns. Then the king took from a chest a large horn made from the antler of a mountain stag. It was hollowed precisely, and each branch of the antler produced a different sounding note. For a troll creation, the children believed it sounded rather beautiful. Once the king had sounded his horn, there was a reply of horns from all around the troll horde. Soon from the forest, on the eastern edge of the meadows, emerged a great number of fairies. At their head rode their king on a large silver horse. The Troll King beckoned Eber to join him on top of the hill. Together the king, Eber, and Bold stood and waited for the procession to arrive. The fairy host halted, and forward rode the king to Ormas, his brother, and Ezcaleb. The children were delighted to see him again. The three fairies walked to the top of the hill, and there the Troll King fell on his face before the Fairy King. For a moment the fairy paused, and it seemed to the children that he was not quite sure how to react. Then, kneeling down, he beckoned the Troll King to stand, and there in front of their two peoples, the two kings embraced. Never before in all the world had such cheers from the fairies and roars of delight from the trolls been heard. The Troll King then took out from a small chest his crown. The trolls went silent and looked on in wonder. The crown seemed to suck in the surrounding light of the afternoon sun, and each troll's heart momentarily became heavy. The king placed the crown on top of a small stone platform, and there the Fairy King handed him a large and beautifully crafted hammer. The Troll King raised the sledge high, and with a mighty blow, the crown was shattered. A shockwave blasted from the broken crown and passed over the crowd and into all the surrounding lands. Soon word was spread that the king's crown had been in fact the Doomstone, carved by the Troll Kings of old into a crown of their oppression. The trolls were free, and oh did they roar! A table was carried to the top of the hill, and there the king sat and discussed many great things. Meanwhile the fairies and the trolls slowly came together,
and so began the celebrations that lasted long into the night. After many hours, Escaleb found the children and Eber and brought them food. The brothers had many questions.
"Why do they still look like trolls?" asked Timo. "Now that the Doomstone has been destroyed, haven't they been fully healed?"
Escaleb paused and smiled.
The scars of the past remain, but their hearts have been healed. Many have even taken new names. He looked over to Nothing, who stood nearby. I hear now he is called Stew. What better name than his favorite food?
They all laughed with joy. Escaleb looked over the large gathering of trolls and fairies.
Never in my life did I think this possible. Never.
He looked at the children with tears in his eyes.
Children of men indeed.
He embraced them and left, for the fairy king was now standing before them. He looked at the brothers in wonder, having been told all about their adventures.
There is nothing I can do or say to ever repay you, children of men, for what you have gifted the fairies today. Long have I waited in hope for the prophecies of old to be fulfilled. You have indeed brought peace to the fairies. Thank you, Jonathan, son of Abba, and thank you, Timo, son of Abba. There is no reward fitting for your deeds. However, I hope these may suffice as a thank you."
He motioned to his aide, who came and brought with him a large chest. From it the king gave to Jonathan a great bow of the fairies, along with a beautiful quiver filled with arrows. Jonathan took the bow in amazement and thanked the king.
"No more taking bows from trolls. And please do not shoot at my brother again."
The king winked, and Jonathan smiled bashfully. To Timo he gave a beautifully embroidered water skin filled with water from the mountain. He also gave him a horn made from a wallow steer, with gold and silver bracing. Timo bowed and thanked the king, and to both he gave carved pendants on silver necklaces.
"These," he said, "are emblems of the House of Hud. Wear these, and you will be welcome in all the 7 fairy kingdoms of the world."
"There are more?" asked Timo in amazement.
"Of course, but that is a learning for another time. I must leave you for now. Thank you, and well go."
Then, coming down from the hill and standing before them, was the Troll King. He now looked very different in clean robes and looked as though he had tried to bath. He knelt to the ground and looked into the children's eyes.
Before we part, I must apologize for many things, but above all, for that which I stole from you 3 years ago.
The children were confused. The king turned, and standing before them, looking very ragged but happy and alive, was their father. They ran to each other and embraced, and all looked on and celebrated. From over the northern hills had come all the captives of the trolls, now released from their prisons. They were brought the healing water from the mountain, and all were healed and all made well. Jonathan and Timo's father, after he had heard all about his children's adventures and had talked long with his brother Eber, stood and looked over all that was happening. "Come, children, come, Eber. Let us leave these important matters to important people. No doubt the kings have much more to discuss. But I want to go home. I am 3 years late for dinner." Together, Abba, Eber, Jonathan and Timo walked through the mountain paths and shared stories. The children had many questions about what their father had experienced, but he would not share too much. "When you're older, perhaps," he said. "Let's not spoil today's happenings with sad tales." And after much walking, they came to their house in the early hours of the morning. "Mum will still be asleep," said Timo. "How should we surprise her?"
"That I must do, my son,"
said Abba, and he asked his children to wait outside while he went in.
"You'll know when to come in."
The children waited obediently, although they wished they could see what was happening.
Their father walked inside, and after a brief minute of silence, there came a loud cry of joy, then tears of happiness. The children ran inside, and there was much celebration. Their mother listened to their story in wonder and could hardly believe her ears. When they came to the part about the healing waters, Timo cried aloud, "I brought some! How could I forget?" He searched through his bag and took out the water skin the fairy king had given him. He poured his mother a large glass, and she drank skeptically, expecting it to be just a glass of water. Within seconds, her foot was completely healed, and she could stand and walk without pain. After that, she believed every word that the children told her of their marvelous adventure. That day they spent together, and many tales were told. Eventually, Timo and Jonathan grew tired, and their father carried them both into bed. Later that night, Jonathan awoke and looked over to his brother, who was also awake. "Psst," he whispered, and Timo turned to face him.
"I've been thinking. You know what Uncle and Escaleb said about the world being big and we being small?" "Yeah, I think I understand it now," said Timo, and he gazed up to the ceiling. "Yeah, the world is big and we are small."
Jonathan grinned.
"All the more room for adventure."
The two brothers laughed and fell back asleep.